Chapter 10, Shrinking the Outer Critic. The enemy of relationship. So, where the inner critic is the part of the mind that views the self as flawed and unworthy, the outer critic is the part of the mind that views everyone else as flawed and unworthy. When the outer critic is running the show, people seem too awful and dangerous to trust. It uses the same perfectionism and endangerment programs against others as the inner critic uses against yourself. The outer critic rejects others because they are never perfect and can't be safe. The outer critic attacks are usually silent, unless you're a fight type. When we regress into the outer critic, we obsess about the imperfection and unsafety of others. Unconsciously, we do this to avoid emotional investment in relationships. The outer critic developed to help us become aware of our parents drifting into their most dangerous behaviours. Over time, everyone becomes as untrustworthy as our parents. Now, the outer critic alienates us from others. It attacks them and scares them away, or builds isolation. Ironically, the critic attempts to protect us from abandonment by scaring us further into it. Deactivate the outer critic's intimacy spoiling arsenal. So, 4F types and outer critic ratios. Different 4F types generally have different ratios of the outer and inner critic dynamics. The freeze and the flight often polarise to the outer critic. Fawn is usually inner critic. Fight types vary, and the subtypes that you have also have an influence on them. So the freeze outer critic is the entire world is unsafe. The flight outer critic is everyone else is inferior. The fawn outer critic is self-hate and self-centering. And the fight, so the fawn is more in the inner critic. The fight controls others to stop them from abandoning them, and pushes them away to stop them getting too close. So it's a bit of both. Fight types can also leave at the first sign that the others can't be controlled. It's not unusual for survivors to experience an increase in their less dominant critic type when they've shrunk their dominant critic type. So, if your dominant critic is the inner critic, and then you're getting good at not having that anymore, the outer critic can get really big, and vice versa. The children are wired to respond angrily to parental abuse and neglect. So most traumatised children learn to erase this and are forced to repress their complaints, making their anger silent. But it doesn't disappear. Instead, it can build as resentment, fueling outer critics' fault finding or seeing danger. Viewing all relationships through the lens of parental abandonment, the outer critic never lets up, constantly transferring unexpressed childhood anger onto others and silently scapegoating them by blowing disappointments out of proportion. When silently blaming the wrong person becomes a habit, it shows up as passive aggression, such as poor listening, hurtful teasing, backhanded compliments, poor follow-throughs as commitments. And then refusing to give voice to the critic's point of view. Being honest to a fault, the book talks about, negatively noticing the imperfect in another. The book calls this the intimacy spoiling program. The inner critic does this by listing confessions of personal faults before someone else does. The outer critic dominated flashbacks blame another person for things, and There's a bit in the book about a story in the book saying that someone with memory issues started to notice that actually it was themselves when they were blaming other people. Where does the outer critic take you to? What story is it trying to get you to repeat? The outer critic is modelled in the media. It is celebrated in our society. TV shows are full of it. Influential adults are judgmental, sarcastic, negative, fear-mongering and scapegoating. Giving control of our social interactions to the outer critic stops vulnerable communication, making intimacy possible. Strategies to be renounced. There's 4 of them here. I will use angry criticism to make you afraid of me so I can be safe from you. Why should I bother with people when everyone is so selfish and corrupt? I will perfectionistically micromanage you to prevent you from betraying, or abandoning me. I will rant and rave or leave at the first sign of a lonely feeling, because if you really loved me, I would never feel lonely. The critic as a subliminal B-grade movie producer. It transmutes unconscious abandonment pain into negative perceptions of people and life, and these fantasies can expand from scary snapshots into film clips and even movies. Anti-intimacy thoughts can become clues that we're in a flashback and need to employ management skills. Watching the news can be a trigger, proof that the world is a dangerous place. Inclination to call a friend can trigger images of rejection and humiliation before the phone can be picked up. Worst case, drasticizing turns to paranoia, and paranoia can turn to fantasies and delusions of persecution. Intimacy and the outer critic. The child never learns that other people can soothe loneliness and emotional pain. Subliminal message of being scorned for seeking parental support. It short circuits our inclination to share and ask for help. Being honest in a job interview, this is a story in the book. It talked about running films through the head about the interview for days afterwards. The no-win situation. Outer critic pushes us to over-control others to make them feel safer. Behaviours include shaming, excessive criticism, monologuing, bossiness. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. There's a double bind. Only severe fight types do this consciously. It also talked about scaring others away with catastrophizing out loud, like broadcasting, forces others to avoid and abandon them. Fluctuating between inner and outer critic. Toxic blame of the outer critic versus toxic shame of the inner critic. The polarities of the grandiose self and the despised self. When we're caught up in this, we miss out on a sense of belonging. The outer critic can refuse to see any positive evidence. It can build a case to justify a higher moral ground and then micromanage for the good of the other. This control is unconsciously protecting us from reenactment of abuse and neglect. Scapegoating. Personal frustrations unfairly dumped on another. Reenactment of parents' abusive role. Indiscriminately raging. Mindfulness and shrinking the outer critic, which is essential for fight types who act out aggressively. Thought stopping, thought substitution, and grief work are utilised again here. When mindfulness appears to intensify the critic. Stirring it up when we begin recovery. We are flashing back to how our parents disapproved of our early protests at their attacks. Our protest function is often killed off before we remember our childhood. So this fear of parental reprisal is often the unconscious dynamic that scares us out of challenging our toxic thinking. When we become less dissociated, we notice more of the critic processes that were always there. Childhood survival was to dissociate from the critic. Decreasing dissociation includes learning to tolerate the pain that comes from discovering how strong the critic is. And noticing thought substitutions, the book suggests listing 5 recollections of positive interactions with a given friend and 5 attributes. It also talks about 5 positives to 1 negative as a guideline. Grieving short-circuits the outer critic. Expressing anger helps to silence it. Crying helps to evaporate it. Anger helps to challenge the all or none perspective that everyone is as dangerous as our parents. Tears can help us realise our loneliness is causing unnecessary pain, which can give us up to the... which... I'm not sure what that says there. Which can encourage us to the possibility of finding safe connections. Defueling the outer critic via working transference. And note here that transference, projection and displacement are all like the same thing. This happens when unprocessed feelings from the past amplify the present time feelings. In outer critic flashbacks, we transfer the emotional pain from past relationships onto current ones. This is what supplies the critic with anger to control, attack, or disapprove of present relationships. As a baby thrives on love, the outer critic thrives on anger, feeding on this anger and then broadcasting it out. Transference can grossly distort our perceptions. We can perceive a harmless person as hurtful. The anger work of grieving the losses of childhood is so essential because it breaks down the critic's supply line to this anger. Grieving old, unexpressed pain about poor parenting slowly deconstructs the process of transferring it onto others. Super important. Love and intimacy don't happen when the critic projects old anger at someone we're intimate with. There is some healthy outer critic venting. Sometimes the outer critic judgments are healthy. Sometimes people are acting as abusively as our parents did in childhood. So the outer critic is healthy when we need to protect ourselves, when someone is attacking us. And it's healthy when we get to grieve. And it talked about road rage and transference with the outer critic. Hitting a tennis racket on a cushion to release anger. I didn't write any more, that would be that. So, yeah, that was Shrinking the Outer Critic.